Welcome to the Ketogeek podcast. Let's do this.
Health, nutrition, fitness, low-carb lifestyle.
Hello everyone, welcome back to our Ketogeek podcast. Before we begin, I just have a few things I wanted to mention. We have actually updated our website, so it looks ridiculously awesome. It's totally new. We've also added a few new products, which is 2 different kinds of our energy pods. One of them is coffee protein, and the other one is our pecan coconut. And we also have our own grass-fed organic ghee that is available online that you can purchase as well. So I just wanted to let you guys know of those things. Some of you people like our products, so don't want you to miss out on some of the newer stuff that we have. Anyway, so who is Gary Wilson? Let me give you guys a little bit of an introduction. So he is the author of Your Brain on Porn, Internet Pornography, and the Emerging Science of Addiction. And he's also the presenter of the popular TEDx talk, which is The Great Porn Experiment, and it has about 9 million views. It has been translated into 18 different languages as well. He also hosts the website Your Brain on Porn, which was created for those seeking to understand and reverse compulsive porn use. You can visit that website by going to yourbrainonporn.com. He's also taught anatomy and physiology for years and has been interested in the neurochemistry of addiction, mating, and bonding. In 2015, the Society for the Advancement of Sexual Health presented Wilson with its Media Award for Outstanding Media Contributions and Public Education on Pornography Addiction. In 2016, Wilson co-authored an academic paper with 7 U.S. Navy doctors entitled, "Is Internet Pornography Causing Sexual Dysfunctions?" A review with clinical reports, and another journal article entitled "Eliminate Chronic Internet Pornography Use to Reveal Its Effects." So my curiosity with this topic came from understanding how food addiction works, how health is influenced by what's happening in our brain. So you might be able to see some similar patterns in this conversation as well. So I think I've rambled enough, so let's get started. Hello everybody, we have Gary Wilson on board now from The Great Porn Experiment. And so Gary, you are a rock star in my eyes. Just before we even say a single word, I just want to say, if your TED Talk was not online, Ketogeek would not have existed. I can't thank you enough. Your message was fantastic. And before we get into the details and nitty-gritty questions, I just want to let you know you're awesome, and we will do anything to promote your message. So anyway, I've rambled. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's an honor for us to have you on board, and let's change some lives. Let's make a difference in this world. So before we get into the questions, do you want to tell us if there's anything new in life, any research that you're working on, anything at all?
Well, I work behind the scenes quite a bit, and what I'm working on now is maybe you've heard there's something called perceived porn addiction. If you haven't, it's a group of studies that came out that suggested that people just believe in porn addiction and they don't have it, and that religious people especially just believe in porn addiction and they don't have it. But a study came out last week that debunked all these previous studies, so I'm working on a long article about that. So that's what I'm working on now. And if you go back last year, one of the things I did work on was a review of the literature on porn-induced sexual problems and the neurobiology behind it. And I did that with 7 U.S. doctors, including psychiatrists and urologists. So that's something that's peer-reviewed, and we're very proud of.
And just to let this out right away, you're talking to an anecdote at the moment. And I can say this story just to get this conversation going, is I faced the same situation. It's one of those things that was hidden in the background. I never knew it existed until I was out there with a woman. I was like, oh, life is great and everything's fantastic. And then it's like, okay, something's not right here. And the gal I was with said, oh, what's going on over here? You're a young guy. This should not be an issue. So this is a really big concern, especially in worlds and societies where there's a lot of where there's too much porn, and people are just getting hooked onto it. And even if they don't, they're just not aware of it. That's the problem. So anyway, just to steer back the conversation into the whole narrative, let's start with your narrative. So how did you get introduced into this world of porn addiction? How did you get started on your brain on porn? What happened?
Well, yeah, it's a strange story. Now, I was an anatomy and physiology teacher for many, many years, and I had written articles with my wife and a book with my wife, and she had a website and she had a forum. And the website had nothing to do with porn at all, or porn recovery. Instead, it was about relationships. And in that, it had many articles about the neurobiology of sex, of bonding, of falling in love, etc. And in those articles, I guess there were keywords like reward system, ejaculation, addiction, dopamine, etc. And we think that Google put these keywords together, and all of a sudden in 2006, men showed up on her forum and said, hey, I think porn is causing sexual problems. And she's like, what are you doing here? Well, evidently, Google put together their posts, and over the next few years, her forum, which had nothing to do with porn, became overrun with men recovering from porn-induced problems. And when they stopped using porn for a significant amount of time, not only did their erectile dysfunction or their inability to ejaculate with a partner go away, but also interesting things changed that were unexpected, such as they could think better, their concentration problems went away, their social anxiety lessened or went away, they had more energy, more motivation, maybe even depression went away, they wanted to get into a relationship. So there were many other benefits that were unexpected. And around 2010 or 2009, we wrote some articles about these events for Psychology Today. And of course, that was the big mistake because a whole lot more men showed up on her site. And then in late 2010, she said, could you make a separate site? And our motivation was these men were suffering. And we knew that there was lots of other men out there who were suffering. And some of them were actually suicidal. They thought they were ruined for life. So I made Your Brain on Porn, not thinking it would really go anywhere. And all of a sudden it exploded. And I actually followed the links that were linking to Your Brain on Porn back to the original source. There were forums that had nothing to do with porn, but it was threads, sometimes 1,000, 2,000 posts long talking about porn-induced problems. So that just exploded. Then I was asked to do a TED Talk, and it exploded again, more traffic. And so it was something neither of us really wanted to get into. We're non-religious, we're very liberal, but we felt that we needed to fill a gap between what was really happening and the complete lack of research into what was happening.
Yeah. And that is so absurd. And if you look at it from, okay, you're with a woman one day and suddenly it's just nothing's going on, and that just scares you. That's a frightening thing. Are you scarred for life? What's wrong? So I'm glad you found the monkey in the room. So anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
It was pretty obvious because the men, they were mostly under 40. They were healthy. Most of them gone to doctors. And it was pretty simple. They gave up porn. They would then go through similar withdrawal symptoms. They would then enter what's called a flat line, where they have a loss of libido for weeks, maybe months. And then eventually their libido would come back, their desire would come back, and then they would get solid erections with a partner. Yeah. So it was pretty obvious the cause and effect. So this isn't correlation. This isn't, we don't think a porn, we don't, it's nothing about assumption. The cause has been found, and there's now 5 studies that have also done the same thing, removed porn and seen young men heal sexual dysfunction. So the debate is over, in my opinion.
And just let's sort of explain to people what the mechanism is, why this happens, the dopamine response. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, if you look at porn-induced sexual dysfunctions, the obvious answer is something called sexual conditioning. So that's just like Pavlovian conditioning. So whereas Pavlov, he had the dog salivate to a bell in anticipating of food. So what goes on with porn-induced ED is that you rewire the brain so that it becomes sexually aroused to everything associated with your porn use. And what would that be? Well, of course, number one, you're a voyeur. You're watching other people do it. Secondly, your extensive, immense amounts of novelty. So guys will put up tabs. Maybe the videos are 2 minutes long, and they'll just click from video to video. So they might go through 100 different videos just in one session. And so none of this can be matched in real life. And so you get with a partner and you can't control the scene. You don't have all this novelty. You don't have the ability to watch. And what happens then is you can't get aroused because it doesn't match what you've been training your brain to do, which is to be a voyeur and click around from scene to scene.
Yeah. So when you're just a regular guy, how would you be able to deduce what are the barometers that you have the porn-induced erectile dysfunction? And especially for guys who may not be with a partner, can they figure it out as well?
Oh, yeah. So the best way to do it if you don't have a partner, or the best test we have, we call it the porn-induced erectile dysfunction test, is you try to masturbate without watching porn, without recalling porn, without fantasizing. And you check to see if you can get an erection or you can orgasm. And you compare that to how your erection and your arousal and your ability to orgasm is while masturbating with porn. Now, any man under 40, unless they have a physical problem, should be able to get an erection without porn. That's just a fact in my world. So that's the test. And what that does is it also gets rid of the possibility of performance anxiety, because if you can't get an erection without porn, you're obviously not having performance anxiety with your own hand. So that's a good test to use.
Got it. And so when someone has this issue with erectile dysfunction, they go off for porn for a little bit. So how long have you seen those results? How soon can they expect their, as you mentioned it, mojo to come back?
Yeah, so that's the number one question we had when we opened the site, and we have a long FAQ about it because, of course, no one can answer that, because how bad, it's like, how bad is their condition? Some men get so bad that they are masturbating to porn with a limp penis. They can't even get aroused, and they've been doing that for years on end. And that might be quite different from someone who's only been using porn for 4 or 5 years, hasn't used it that much, and they'll lose their erection during sex, and maybe porn's the cause. So there's all sorts of levels of porn-induced erectile dysfunction. So here's the scary thing, is back in 2006, about the time that porn tube sites were invented, and the men were showing up on my wife's forum, most of these men were in their 30s, and were high-tech geeks and had gotten high-speed internet earlier. And so we think that because they had high-speed internet, they were able to use videos, and then they developed porn-induced ED earlier. But here's the key thing, is when these older men who didn't grow up using internet porn quit, they often healed their erectile dysfunction within 6 to 8 weeks. Now, in 2017, we've seen that many of the young men who develop severe porn-induced DD might need 6 months, 9 months, a year. We've even seen some needing 2 years. So there's a real big difference between growing up and conditioning your sexual arousal during adolescence than there is conditioning your sexual arousal as an adult.
Got it. How earlier in the lifetime of anyone have you noticed this? Are there teenagers who are getting hooked on here and losing their mojo, or what are some of the anecdotes?
Yeah, so the youngest porn-induced DD story, and these are stories of people who recover from porn-induced DD, is age 14.
Whoa.
I know, I found that unbelievable, but they give their story, and the story was that they had started viewing porn when they were like 8 or 9. So they became interested, and they were viewing it before they were able to masturbate to it. Wow. And so once they're able to start masturbating and having an orgasm, maybe age 11, then they continued for every day. So by age 14, they just couldn't get aroused by a real girl. Wow.
Now here's the scary question. Can this change be permanent?
Yeah, well, I think that it's not. You know, it is pretty disconcerting that we're seeing some young men who grew up with internet porn needing 2 years or longer. The reason I don't think it's permanent is because the brain is amazing and it has this ability to change constantly. So you read stories like in Norman Deutsch's book, The Brain That Changes Itself, of someone maybe having a stroke and damaging the whole right side of their cerebrum that controls movement on their left side, but through special training using mirrors and other unique aspects, they're able to rewire the brain so that they can now even jog. So if someone who is damaged a whole section of their brain can rewire it to function correctly, then I think young men can do so. But here's the deal, is they often say, the young men say, what they have to do now is not just quit using porn, they have to rewire their arousal to real people. So they have to start dating. They start having to touch, look at women. They have to retrain their brain. There's lots of different ways to do it, but that's what a lot of them say they must do in order to get aroused.
Yeah, and that's a superb challenge. That's a very big challenge with the advent of the social media, with the internet, where you're in a state of perpetual feasting. It's accessible to you for free. You're the king now, and so I would imagine your brain just wants to be there, and you just have to say no to it. This is just a big challenge across the board in our society. This instant gratification influencing us. So here's a question. How have you noticed, as far as what are some of the anecdotes that you've noticed as far as marriages are concerned, relationships? Is it wrecking it apart?
Well, I think it's affecting it. If we look at statistics, we see that there's been a tremendous drop in sexual intercourse rates. For example, in young people, it was if you looked at those in the 10th grade, back in 1995, 38% were having sex, and now only 30% were having sex. Then we look at Japan, and they did a survey in 2010, and 36% of young men weren't interested in having sex. And they also did it on couples, and I think it's over 50% of the couples weren't interested in having sex. So we're seeing not necessarily divorce be directly related, though it may be, to porn, but just that interacting sexually has declined in the few studies that have been looking at that. Now, if you look at studies that correlate porn use with relationship satisfaction, there's now over 50 studies that have found that porn use is linked to less relationship satisfaction and less sexual satisfaction. And some of those studies are longitudinal, meaning that they follow couples over time, and they find that more porn use over time is related to significantly greater divorce or breakup or even decreases in sexual satisfaction, relationship satisfaction. So the evidence is there, both anecdotally and in studies.
That is absurd. So what kind of activities are indirectly influenced by porn use? What have you noticed among people, for example, at work or at their sports? Are there any reports on that?
Well, there's just like hundreds of thousands of reports on these other benefits that occur. And actually, it's hard for me to say which is the most common, but one of the most common is they start to feel more emotions. They start to feel things again. They felt sort of like numb, like Spock on Star Trek, just no emotions. And now they feel them again. Another very common, almost universal report is that they'll be able to think better. They can remember more easily. Their brain fog has gone away. Another very common one is motivation. They now have motivation to go out and do what they want to do, whether it's a sport, a hobby, or a new job, or go back to school. That's pretty significant. Social anxiety decreasing is quite common. What's really common is wanting to socialize more. So you can see if any one of these changes, it has a big effect on your life. But if you have several of these changes, like you have more motivation, you can think more clearly, you want to engage the world, that's going to have a huge effect on every aspect of your life. So we see this over and over again. And right now, I have lists of studies on the front of my website. And one of the lists is porn correlating with poorer cognitive function. There's about 10 studies like that. And there's about 30 studies linking porn to depression, social anxiety, and other emotional problems. So it's not without studies backing it up.
And you can use me as an anecdote. I mean, I'm a study of one, and I just noticed right away that my emotions came back, and I found femininity and sexuality more attractive that way. So that was really like a switch, sort of moving from one direction to another direction, with time, of course. So what do you think, hypothetically, what would be the mechanisms? Why do people get this sudden switch? Is it the dopamine responses that are changing, the reward mechanism that's getting rewired, or these hormones that are getting modified? What's up with that?
Yeah, all this is conjecture, and a lot of even the guys on the forums, they talk about conjecture. And so when you're doing conjecture, you have to sort of look at what science do we have. And so the science of the reward system can show us quite a bit. And the reward system is a bunch of structures deep in the brain, and it's common in all mammals. And it's there to motivate you to do things like have sex, eat food, bond, fall in love, take risks. It's also activated, this reward system, for play, for achievement, and even for novelty. And of course, that's one of the problems, because your reward system gets activated for novelty. And of course, what's the internet? Nothing but endless novelty. So it's very attractive to our reward system. And that's why we can sit and click all day long. But here's the deal. So the reward system is powered by dopamine. And dopamine isn't a pleasure chemical so much as they think it's a motivation chemical. So when you smell a hamburger and you're hungry, you have the motivation to get off the freeway and go to McDonald's. So that's dopamine going up to give you motivation. But dopamine also works in long-term motivation. So you start as a college freshman and you want to graduate with a business degree. Well, your ability to continue to study throughout those years is dopamine being released because you have this long-term goal. So dopamine's all about motivation. And what they've found is in addictions, or even not even just addictions, but chronic overstimulation, whether it's junk food or gambling or internet use, internet addiction, that the dopamine system's affected so that there's less dopamine being produced, or there's maybe less dopamine receptors. And maybe this affects dopamine's other functions. So that's conjecture. And the other functions would be low dopamine is, in the scientific research, associated with depression. It's associated with low motivation. It's associated with social anxiety. And of course, it's associated with poor cognition. They give people with ADHD dopamine raising drugs. So perhaps the dopamine system's affected. A second addiction brain change is in the frontal cortex, and the frontal cortex does so much of our higher thought, our planning, many things. So when someone has an addiction, the frontal cortex becomes inhibited, and it no longer can do the many functions that it is supposed to do, such as motivation and cognition and planning and how to achieve things. So perhaps these things are occurring. We're having the dopamine system affected, the frontal cortex affected. Maybe the stress system's affected because there's studies that are associating dysfunctional stress system with both internet addiction and porn addiction. And the stress system is out of whack, that can really mess you up. So it's hard to say exactly what's going on. It could be a combination of these, or it could be the unknown.
Yeah, and that's the fascinating thing, is where a big circuitry where you pull the plug in one area and now you've created a ripple effect. And speaking of ripple effects, what kind of ripple effects have you seen in society that may have been somewhat related to excessive porn usage? Like, for example, is there an increase in rape, sexual assaults, or anything of that sort?
Well, one of the things is might be looked at as a benefit, and that's a drop in pregnancies and a drop in adolescents having sex, which is pretty astounding. The drops have been significant, like a drop of 40% in adolescents having sex in the United States, and another huge drop, close to 50% in the Netherlands. There's not too many studies on this. And of course, at the same time, this has been occurring in the last 15 years, there's been a 1,000% increase in erectile dysfunction rates in men under 40. So that's just unbelievable. So historically, the erectile dysfunction rates for men under 40 have been usually about 2 to 3%. That makes sense. But now there's been about 6 studies looking at it, and the rates range from about 14 to 33% in men under 40. And some of those rates are higher than for men over 40. So we're seeing very strong hints of it affecting sexuality. As far as the rape thing goes, you'll see in articles that they correlate in some countries the increase in porn with a decrease in rape. And that's rather complex for a couple of reasons. The first reason is what has really occurred in those developing countries that might account for it, in my opinion, is aging. So the population has aged, and so there's a much smaller percentage in the age group, usually about 16 to 40, that are the ones that are most likely to rape. Another problem with those rape statistics, analysis was done on the U.S., is that they really think that the reported rapes have gone down, when in fact the actual rapes in the last 20 years have been some of the highest. So depending on reported rapes may not be accurate. And thirdly, it doesn't get at sexual aggression or young men wanting their partners to do things they normally wouldn't do. And one of the best examples is a study that actually looked at young people and anal sex, because it kept coming up in some of their surveys. And this was the UK. And they found that there was a big increase in young people doing anal sex, but when they interviewed these young people, they found, of course, what was the reason? They wanted to copy porn. But secondly, that neither the male nor the female enjoyed it. And many of the interviews revealed that the females felt coerced, but they also felt it was normal. So since porn is normalizing all sorts of things sexually, we don't report them as, sexual aggression, or they don't show up in studies, because both the male and female now in 2017 think that, rough anal sex is normal. It's the way it should be. And so it's really hard for studies to get at, what's really going on in the bedroom.
Yes, and there's plenty of anecdotes, and I think you also suggested in your TED Talk that people start to cascade towards a more extreme side of sexuality and sexual experiences because the normal stuff or the regular sexual intercourse doesn't seem to give them that rush. Is that correct?
Yeah, so that's reported over and over again. I remember back not long ago, NoFap, Reddit NoFap, you know that place?
Yes, I'm well aware of that.
Yeah, so it's a huge recovery forum, about 250,000 members. And they did a survey of their members, a huge survey, and they found that close to 60% had escalated to porn that they previously found offensive or not interesting. And half of them were upset about it, the other half weren't. And then recently, some studies have asked the same question. So there was a 2016 study called Online Sexual Activities, an exploratory study of problematic and non-problematic usage in a sample of men. Anyhow, what it found is that 50% of the men had mentioned that they're now searching for sexual content or porn that previously wasn't interesting to them or they found disgusting. So that's showing escalation. And we have several other studies that have come out that hint at escalation. They also hint at tolerance, which is needing greater and greater stimulation to get the same buzz. In fact, a brain study from the Max Planck Institute found that the more porn used, the less gray matter there was in certain parts of the reward system, but also with those same people, the more porn used, the less arousal they had, less brain activation they had to vanilla porn. And so these were not addicts. They excluded addicts, porn addicts. So, there's things going on without even addiction that are being reported in the peer-reviewed literature.
Yes, and let's explain to the people that are listening the whole dopamine resistance system that sets up where you get tons of dopamines flushed in and then the receptors start diminishing, or something like that. Would you like to explain that?
Yeah, so dopamine powers the reward system and it powers motivation. And when you have high level of dopamine, it's a signal. And the first signal is, this is very important and you need to remember it. And so that's a normal signal with normal dopamine, whether it's sex or eating food. And so what it tells you with sex, let's say you're watching porn, is, oh, this is very important. I had an orgasm, very high dopamine. This is very important. I need to remember everything around it. But what it does over time is it starts to rewire the brain so that everything that occurred during that event actually releases dopamine without that event. So the best example is, let's say, cocaine. If you're a cocaine user and you become addicted, cocaine releases a tremendous amount of dopamine and you become addicted, then the sight of white powder releases tremendous amount of dopamine, maybe more than using cocaine itself. Maybe the neighborhood, maybe that you go to releases dopamine. So what that leads to is cravings to use and cravings that are hard to control. And that's one of the things that occurs in addiction, but it's also a natural thing. So addiction really hijacks the natural mechanism of craving. And when you're having sex or eating junk food, you're supposed to then do it again because it's important. Junk food is concentrated calories, and you're supposed to eat concentrated calories to survive. At least you were as a hunter-gatherer. If you're a hunter-gatherer and you have sex with a person, not watching porn, you're supposed to remember everything about it because you want to do it again so that you can reproduce. But now we have junk food instead of dried venison, right, and boiled roots. And now we have internet porn instead of real partners. So this ancient mechanism that's supposed to get you excited, release dopamine in anticipation of do something, is now hijacked for things that don't further your survival or the survival of your genes.
Wow.
So that's the beginning, that's the beginning of the event. So that's called sensitization, and it's the main brain change in addiction, causes extreme cravings. The other part is once you pound the reward system with dopamine, it starts to rebel. And it's sort of like someone covering their ears when they're being screamed at. And yes, it can reduce the dopamine receptors. It can also reduce the amount of dopamine produced. And there's other ways, other chemicals that can be released that also interrupt the amount of dopamine. And so there's many mechanisms that can down-regulate your dopamine system. And what does this lead to? It leads to you having to have more of it, whatever it is, to get a buzz. So a drug addict will take more drugs. An alcoholic will drink more alcohol. A porn user can't really do more, though they may. What they will do is escalate. And they'll escalate into genres of porn that cause shock or anxiety or surprise. And why would they do that? Well, shock, surprise, and anxiety increase dopamine. And they also increase adrenaline and norepinephrine, which actually increase dopamine's effects. So that's why you hear about young men escalating into stuff that really is nasty, whether it's bestiality or findom porn or incest porn. They were never interested in that, but it's anxiety producing. It's shocking. It releases adrenaline. It releases more dopamine, and that way they can get aroused. Does that make sense?
Oh, it perfectly makes sense. And now I eventually we're going to talk a little bit about the other gender for a little bit. But let's get back to the dopamine. So do we know what kind of... Is there like a ranking of some sort where this activity is going to release this much of dopamines? Or can we gauge that, measure that? Can we make sense out of this madness?
Yeah, so you know, the question is always, wow, porn releases a lot of dopamine. Well, the truth is it probably releases the same amount as sex. But what happens over time is sex starts to release less dopamine because your brain compares sex with a real person to porn. So it's not like porn is off the charts. This is me just conjecturing. That's not a real word, but just thinking about it. So the original question is, can you measure dopamine? The only way you can measure dopamine is to actually put a pipe in someone's brain and actually take little samples. So we can't do that to humans. We've only done it with rats. And with rats, you see that sex is by far the highest level of dopamine naturally available. So sex increases dopamine in the reward center. So there's one place in the system that is very important called the center of the reward system. And it goes up about 200%. But interesting enough, morphine also increases dopamine levels about 200%. Nicotine increases morphine levels about 200%. And nicotine is the most addictive drug. And why do I say that? Is because nicotine addicts the highest percentage of users compared to any other drug. So it's not necessarily the high levels of dopamine, but it's the continuous levels of dopamine. So with cigarettes, you're constantly taking puffs and reinforcing the dopamine. With porn, what do the guys do? Well, yeah, a guy might go on to Pornhub. He might masturbate for 7 minutes and ejaculate and be done. Yes, that's high dopamine. But a lot of guys report binging for maybe 2 hours straight every night, edging to porn without ejaculating. And so that keeps dopamine at this very high level at 200%. And it's now wiring in everything associated with those high dopamine levels, which is clicking from video to video, and it's training the brain. So no, we can't measure directly dopamine levels in humans. We can in rats, but we can indirectly, not very accurately, measure dopamine levels in humans, but that's sort of a complex subject where they, I'm not going to get into it, but it's not directly. And they haven't done that with porn yet because it's a very expensive experiment. They've done it with some drugs. They've done it with actually video games once back in 1999. So it's a very expensive and complex proposition to indirectly guess at dopamine levels. I'll say that. So that's a long-winded explanation, but anyhow, the bottom line is this. Sexual stimulation and orgasm releases the highest levels of dopamine and by far the highest level of opioids, commonly called endorphins, that are available to humans. So it's by far the most powerful reinforcer. We know the difference between eating an apple and having a mind-blowing orgasm. And one of the reasons is the high levels of dopamine and opioids.
Wow, you're blowing up my brain, which is awesome, by the way. So, can this response be induced in every person? Can they all fall prey to it, or some people are just resistant to it?
Well, absolutely. You mean to compulsive porn use, or?
Let's talk about porn use. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, a lot of people. That's the interesting thing about porn. So for all of us, sexual stimulation feels good. Proper, good sexual stimulation is arousing and releases dopamine. But for a lot of people, watching porn is aversive. They hate it. Maybe they just don't like it. They find it disgusting. But at the same time, most men become aroused when they watch porn. So for men, it's close to universal sexual arousal, which means they can fall prey to it. Now, interesting enough, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, they keep looking at rates of porn use. And an Australian study came out and it found finally that 100% of men ages 16 to 29 had used porn. So that's quite a statistic. And they found that 40% of the men used it daily. So that's such a tremendous change from the 1970s and 80s where we might see a once a month picture of Playboy. These people are watching hardcore, nasty porn of real people having so-called real sex, where when I grew up in adolescence, all I did was look at a Playboy and all I could see were boobs. And all I could think about what to do was, I can fill up boobs. And now I got an erection. Or now the young men are watching hardcore starting before puberty and they're learning all about sex. This is their education for years and years before their first kiss. So it's really quite a paradigm shift.
Yes, and that's so crazy if you think of it from like a third-person alien perspective, that we're hooked onto something that doesn't really exist or exists in a virtual plane, and it causes such physical changes in the brain, which are kind of hard to reverse. So let's talk about addiction in general. So if I were to ask you a question, what is addiction? How would you respond?
Well, addiction, you want to first go by behavior. So if you look at all the psychiatric manuals, whether it's the DSM, that's the United States, or the ICD, and that's the World Health Organization, they all diagnose conditions through signs and symptoms. And of course, that makes sense. You go to a doctor, they don't take a brain scan. If you have, a cold or flu, they just ask you your symptoms. So what would be the symptoms of any addiction? Well, they all share similar behaviors. And so I like to use the 4 C's, which are the compulsion to use, which is really cravings that are hard to ignore. And the main one is continued use despite severe negative consequences. So a guy continues to masturbate to porn, even though he knows he can't get an erection because of porn. Or inability to control use. So you say, I'm not going to use today. I swear to God. And then you use anyhow. That's another sign of addiction. And of course, cravings. And cravings are caused by, again, this physical change called sensitizations. And, it's just, you go to your computer, you turn it on, and all of a sudden you have cravings to go to, Pornhub or something. When in fact, what you wanted to do was read USA Today. And if you don't, you can't ignore those. So those together are sort of a good sign and symptoms of behaviors. And so when you go to the doctor and you ask them and you give them the symptoms of the flu, like I'm sneezy, I'm achy, I have a temperature, they say you have the flu. Your body has changed. It now has an infection. Well, that's what's going on with addiction. If you have the signs and symptoms of an addiction, that means your brain chain has changed in very specific ways that are causing that addiction. And that's just pure pathology, which I taught for 25 years. You know, if you have swelling in your ankle and it's blue and you can't step on it, you sprained your ankle. You know, so it's signs and symptoms lead to tell you what the physical changes are.
Yeah. So what are some of the ingredients that you have noticed that seem to pop up in this addictive pattern? What creates this perfect storm?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. You know, the perfect storm. Again, I want to emphasize that addiction is not necessary. So even though we talk a lot about addiction, addiction brain changes are on a continuum, and they have seen brain changes and behavior changes related to porn that are occurring in people who aren't addicted. There are studies on my front page that show that. So one of the common things that is put out there is, okay, well, only a small percentage of people get addicted to porn, a very small percentage. And therefore, only a small percentage are affected. So what they're saying is porn's effects are binary. You either have no problem at all, even though you're masturbating to it every day, or you have an addiction and you're of the small percentage. First, let's look at the small percentage, whether that's true or not. So 2 studies came out in 2016 asking men who had used porn in the last 6 months questions. And they found out in both studies, 28% of them met the criteria for addiction. A 2017 study on college students found that 19% of the college sophomores and freshmen, the males, were addicted to porn. So it's not small. The second thing is, here's the difference. So when you look at rats and you look at humans, and let's talk about alcohol or cocaine or those type of drugs. You know, when you take rats and you give them cocaine or you give them alcohol, only about 15% really become severely addicted. The rats are like, man, I prefer having sex. I prefer having food than, you know, taking my little bit of cocaine. But that's drugs. Drugs are naturally aversive. They make us feel weird. They make us feel bad. Now let's go to something like modern junk food. Modern junk food is what the reward system and our bodies were designed to consume. We find fat, sugar, and certain tastes very appealing. We eat every day. And what do we have now? With modern junk food, we have 37% of adult Americans obese. None of them want to be. We have 75 to 80% of adult Americans overweight. They're being exposed to a supernormal stimulus, concentrated fats, concentrated sugars, available everywhere, advertised all the time, very tasty. Those do not compare to what we ate as a hunter-gatherer. Dried meat, dried salmon every day, you know, raw nuts, berries. That is not a supernormal stimulus. So our brains are designed to overconsume supernormal versions of natural rewards. And that's what internet porn is. It's taking advantage of the most important reward, which is reproduction. It's taking advantage of the highest levels of dopamine and opioids. And it's taking advantage of it during adolescence, which is the time you're supposed to learn everything about sex, and you are extremely horny and you want to see everything you can about sex. So that's the difference between junk food, between video games, between internet porn and drugs. And here's the other thing that's different about internet porn. There are no analogies to it. there are no innate circuits for Call of Duty, for first-person shooter. There are innate circuits, huge, complex ones, for sex and reproduction. And those innate circuits are being hijacked by internet porn. We young men are not playing Call of Duty to become assassins or to go to Iraq and fight. They are playing it just for rewards. There are no innate circuits for video games. So I really want to make that point. There is no analogy to internet porn.
Yes, and all I'm thinking right now is that now you're the warrior playing that video game, simulating the action, and you get the reward immediately when you close that tab off and switch to porn, and now you have perpetual women, and that's given to you for free. And so it seems like our brain isn't...
Yes, exactly.
Our brain isn't geared for this sort of instant gratification that everybody has now.
Well, my TED Talk back in 2012... I did it as what's called a response. So I responded to Philip Zimbardo's TED Talk, The Demise of Guys, and a response means adding to it. And of course, he saw this back in 2010, was it, when he did the TED Talk? A very short, very popular one. And Philip Zimbardo is the guy who did the Stanford experiment. He was the head of the American Psychological Association, the president. So he said, hey, video games and porn are really affecting this generation of young men.
Yeah. Well, so could anything be addictive? Could you make anything addictive? I know it's a very general question, but can you addict it? Is there an answer to that?
Yeah, well, often naysayers. So I'm going to turn around to how it's used. So over and over, I see articles, and they're so inane, these articles. In fact, one of the most common persons who is sort of anti-porn addiction. Her name's Nicole Prouse. Another one's David Lay. And they both make this crazy claim that masturbating to porn is no different neurologically than watching puppies play. They actually say this. And Prouse claims to be a neuroscientist, but how could a neuroscientist say that there's no difference? There's tremendous difference. There's massive amounts of studies that show that sex and orgasm are way different neurologically and hormonally than any other natural reward. In fact, experiments on rats have found something very interesting. So you go to the reward system and you get right down in it and you separate the different nerve cells and you can actually measure them in a rat. And what they found is that sexual stimulation activates a separate group of nerve cells, even though it's dopamine and opioids, in the reward system. And that set of nerve cells is the exact same set of nerve cells that are activated with addictive drugs like meth, cocaine, and heroin. And yet, there's another group of nerve cells sort of right next to it that are for other natural rewards like food and water. So sex is unique. The actual nerve cells activated by sex are separated to a large extent from other rewards. And this is why addictive drugs like heroin and cocaine feel so good, is because they're actually hijacking and using the nerve cells for sex, and they're activating them. And, it's really, really different. So your original question is, can we get addicted to anything? I don't think we can get addicted to anything. You might hear of I'm addicted to rock and roll, or I'm addicted to Harry Potter novels. But addiction involves, the continued use despite negative consequences, the compulsion to use, cravings. It involves many things that, you can't really classify as an addiction when you say, I'm addicted to watching basketball.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody wants to read the Harry Potter novel for 7 times straight and get the same amount of reward out of it. Maybe there are certain people, I don't know who they are, but that's a difficult feat to accomplish. So let's let's play a little bit of a devil's advocate here. And you mentioned a couple of benefits of porn usage. Is there anything else that could potentially help us? Like, for example, if you're on a deep space mission where you don't have access to women, or you're somewhere where there's like a sausage festival going on, or maybe you are so busy with your life and career, all you want to do is focus on that and just use 10 years of your life just to utilize porn for your sexual gratification. I know I'm thinking outside of the box. Does that even make sense, or is that just a crazy approach?
Yeah, so the common question I get is, well, do you think there's any benefits of porn? And I don't think there really are. So, what is porn now in 2017? It's going to a porn tube site and clicking from video to video, and you're watching stuff that doesn't even resemble sex. And a lot of it's misogynistic, it's violent. It's just not real sex. So I can't see any benefit. And here's something that sort of amazes the young people. So I'm past the age 60. And guess what? We actually masturbated with our imagination, or we masturbated just through feeling. We didn't need porn to get aroused. And so that may seem like a strange thing in 2017, but that's the way it's supposed to be. A young man, or even a relatively old man, should be able to get aroused without having to click from video to video of, gang rape or crazy stuff. And so I can't think of a benefit that would outweigh the downside. Say someone is without a relationship for 10 years. Well, maybe at the end of 10 years, they want to get into a relationship. What have they done? Well, they've jerked off to porn every day. And so what's their brain going to be conditioned to? Jerking off to porn every day. So when they get with a woman, it's going to be like, yawn. So I just don't see much of a benefit.
And I think another problem would be that you could potentially go back to your old routine once you have a few bad days with your woman. You're like, oh, I'm not getting any, so I'm just going to go back to the same old routine. And speaking of relationships and women, let's delve into that aspect, because that seems to be the evading part. Now, I sent a text to one of my female friends and I said, what's the female version of porn? And she said, Google up romance novels and relationships. And so it made me think, what's going on? Is it the romance novels that are affecting them? Is it porn that is affecting them? Or is it the Instagram where they get these tons of likes? That seems to be the general stereotype out there, where it seems like men are just competing for their attention. So it's kind of simulating that hundreds of or thousands of warriors trying to pursue this one woman, and you're getting liked and adored by them. So what's up with that? What's going on over there?
So I guess you're asking, what about women in porn, and what are they attracted to?
Yeah, what would be the female version of porn? Or is porn still attractive or addictive for women as well?
Well, it's certainly addictive, but the rates are a lot lower. Like in that college study, 4% of the women were addicted. And in another recent study, 4% of the women used every day. So there's a certain percentage of women who do use a lot. But you're right. I think it's sort of common that a lot of women like porn with stories, or they just like to read sexual stories. And people hate to admit to it, but men and women are different. They are wired different, and men are more visual, without a doubt. And so with women, it's always the hardest question for me to answer. You can see I'm stumbling, because we do see women who are addicted and they have problems. I think what's occurring is there's an increase in the percentage of females that are using regularly, but it's not as big a problem for women. And if you look at these forums, so many, it's just such a small percentage of the porn recovery forums are women, but women like stories. So I agree with that, but I don't think I'm able to really answer your question as well as you'd like.
No, I totally understand that. And that was the complicated part, is what's the modern challenge for a woman right now? What can she get hooked onto? Or there's just too much out there. The only closest thing I was thinking was maybe some of the social media stuff where, you get tons of likes and you have an Instagram account.
Absolutely.
So you had something to add?
So absolutely with the Facebook. And so the studies, there's internet addiction studies, and I have about 240 brain studies on internet addicts listed, and every single brain study has found the same brain changes that occur in drug addicts. Do you believe that? So that's 240. So, but they're starting to do more on social media, especially Facebook, and they are finding that the women tend to have higher rates of addiction to Facebook, higher rates of use. And of course, these addiction rates and these high rates of use are often associated with emotional problems like anxiety, depression, social anxiety. But here's the interesting thing. About last month, they did a study where they had people stop using Facebook for about, 14 days or a week? And their scores on depression and anxiety and other things actually decreased. So they removed Facebook and they became emotionally more healthy just after a week of not being on Facebook.
Yes, and it makes me think that if you have your happiness dependent on someone else's validation instead of your intrinsic qualities, I would imagine that would kind of make you feel depressed. Anyway, this was just me being a little philosophical and thoughtful.
No, it's a big deal because a lot of people are being affected, especially the teens. They're constantly looking for ways to get likes, because if you go back to dopamine, so dopamine, you go to Twitter, and as soon as you click on Twitter, before you even open up, you have dopamine, and dopamine is anticipation. Oh boy, something's going to happen. And then what occurs with dopamine? So if you expect to have 10 likes and you have no likes, what occurs? With no likes, your dopamine drops and you feel bad. So what you're having is you're constantly playing with your dopamine. If you have, instead of 10 likes like you expected, you have 50 likes, now you get another squirt of dopamine because it was better than expected. Dopamine is released under all circumstances when something is better than expected. So all these systems, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, internet porn, or video games, are taking advantage of the dopamine system. Of course they do. We wouldn't be doing these things unless dopamine was released to motivate us to click on Facebook.
Yes, and that makes me also sort of think about the Tinder sort of the dating thing, where you are conditioned to meet this hot guy, and you find this one hot guy. Now your dopamine wants to find an even hotter guy. So you're like swipe, 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 swipe. And I just posted a sort of personal study where 80% of the women were more gravitated towards the top 20% of the attractive men and that kind of stuff. So,
oh yeah, that one, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
No, I remember that study, yeah.
So that's one thing I noticed, and the same results it was a very similar result in OkCupid as well when they did that analysis. So maybe dopamine has to play a role there as well.
Yeah, I mean, these dating apps are something else. I mean, it's just unbelievable. I always like to compare it to a hunter-gatherer. And so if you're a hunter-gatherer and you got a small tribe of 50, you've grown up with about the 3 or 4 girls that you could possibly have sex with. You'd have to go to another tribe to find another 3 or 4 girls over on the other side of the mountain. And now you can just swipe, 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 swipe while you're at the bar through 100 pictures and decide who you're going to have sex with. It's unbelievable. So that's what your brain, of course, gets conditioned to. And what are the effects? Well, we're seeing a tremendous increase in the age of first marriage. It's gone up several years. I think it's in the late 20s now, when it used to be in the early 20s, and marriage rates are declining. So it's interesting. Maybe the Tinder is also having an effect, just like porn is.
Yep. And this brings us back to the same concept where I think there's plenty of anecdotes that state that once I quit porn addiction and this perpetual feasting of women, that sounds really brutal, by the way, but once I give up that, I start to find girls that are around me far more attractive. And I can testify to that, by the way. So that was a good observation. But let's go and try to create a hypothetical situation. Let's say if I have this addiction going on, what should I do right away? What steps can I take?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't even label it if you have an addiction going on. I would suggest to everyone who's a porn user to take a break. And I would suggest, for some reason, they say 90 days on NoFap. Well, yeah, go ahead, take 90 days. A lot of guys, if they think about 90 days, they go, oh my God, I'm not going to do it. So I suggest, try a couple weeks, see what happens. Well, often men who are continually using will go through withdrawal symptoms, or they'll enter what's called the flat line, which is a loss of libido. So I suggest everyone take a break. Try to take a break as long as you can. If you have trouble taking a break, then that indicates that you have some sensitization. You have brain changes that cause you to crave to use porn. But here's the thing about taking a break. Some people who are severely addicted, if they take a break, they get a lot worse before they get better. So they may feel really bad, and then they will go back to porn, and then they'll feel better, just like a drug addict would go back to their drug to feel better. So you want to take a long break. Now, when it comes to addicts, that becomes very complex. Some people who do experience addiction, do experience withdrawal symptoms and cravings and everything associated with addiction, they quit. And they can stay off porn relatively easy, usually because they have motivation. They feel so much better without porn, or their ED goes away. Other people, another group of people, may have some underlying issues, social anxiety, depression. They may be genetically more predisposed to addiction. Some of those genetic changes might have them have abnormally low dopamine, genetically low dopamine, so that makes them want to raise their dopamine, so they use porn. So those individuals, and especially those with trauma or other issues, will have to address that. They might have to have a program. There are online programs. They may have to go to a therapist. So everyone needs to find their way depending on their level of addiction and their history.
And what kind of resources do they have available at the moment? As if it's me, where do I go? Where do I even begin?
Well, we have pages with lots of off-site resources. So you can go to Your Brain on Porn, and there's right at the top, there's a support page, and that has lots of forums and resources you can go to. You can go to Rebooting. It just says Rebooting, and you can click on that, and it'll have a main article with links to many, many, many resources, and anyone can get started there. So all those resources are pretty much free, and there's lots of places and forums where men can help each other, and that's a good place to start.
Awesome. And now we have some bigger questions at the end, where the first one would be, what is your message, if you have any, to the younger generation of boys and gals that are coming up?
Yeah, if you talk to an adolescent, and I know I was a very stubborn one, I guess I'm a stubborn adult, and if someone tells you what to do, well, you often do the opposite. So yes, you can warn adolescents about drugs, about driving too fast, about having unprotected sex, but often they have to learn on their own. And I want to educate them and warn them of the possibilities of what could occur with porn. I'm going to tell them something they're not going to want to hear, and I don't think that watching internet porn is particularly healthy. It doesn't get you where most adolescents want to get, and that's with a partner, with a girlfriend, with a boyfriend, with whatever, in relationships. So it's not really a good thing. So I would try to avoid it as much as possible, not because it's sinful or because someone told you not to, but because it has detrimental effects. Eating at McDonald's has detrimental effects. Sitting on your ass playing video games for 5 hours straight has detrimental effects. There's no doubt about any of these. So we can tell the adolescents about it, the young people about it, but I live in the real world, and most of them have to find out on their own.
And what about the parents and educators? What can they do?
Well, there's, most parents are as ignorant as possible. They think that they go back to their youth, let's say growing up in the 70s or in 80s, and all they can remember is a Playboy or a Penthouse and looking at pictures. They have no idea what a porn tube site is. Well, maybe their dad does. But to realize that Johnny isn't going to wait until he's 17 to go on to Pornhub. He's going to go on Pornhub at age 10 and 11 with his friends, and they're going to click from video to video. And that's how they're learning about sex and relationships and how to view the opposite sex. And the same thing goes for females. They also end up having their view of males shaped. So the adults need to get this into their head, and they need to tell them that porn is negative and it's different from what they grew up with. So that's pretty important. If they were up for it, I would have them watch my TED Talk. I'd have them watch some of the many videos made by the guys who've posted videos on my site, like Gabe Deem or Noah Church or others, because these are young men who can talk to them. So I would give them a chance, because when people like Gabe Deem or Noah Church or others go out and talk to young men, they listen. And at least they're aware. So first we need awareness, and that's where we need to stop. And to say that, it's just healthy, masturbation's healthy. Well, we're not talking about masturbation. We're talking about sitting and watching Pornhub, clicking through videos. We're not talking about masturbation. So it's important to keep in any discussion masturbation and hardcore streaming porn as separate issues.
Yeah. So here's a question for you, which is, what kind of research would you like to see in the future? What kind of trials?
Well, interesting enough, I actually have a peer-reviewed paper that discusses that. And very simply, it says that we should have studies that have people stop using for a period of time. You assess them before, and you can assess them in many ways, psychologically, otherwise, and you can assess them afterwards. And interesting enough, there's been some studies that have done that. For example, a study looked at, had people quit porn for 3 weeks. They assessed how they viewed their partner. And after 3 weeks, those that had quit porn, the other group, the control group, was asked to quit their favorite food. They viewed the partner much better. Another study was very similar. One group quit their favorite food. Another group tried to stop using porn for 3 weeks. Now, these were not addicts. And they found that the group that quit porn had a much better ability to delay gratification. You remember the old marshmallow experiment? Are you familiar with that?
No, I'm not. Would you like to elaborate?
So the marshmallow experiment, you can go on YouTube and you'll find it. And they take like a 5-year-old and they bring him into a room and they say, okay, if you don't eat this marshmallow while I'm gone, when I come back, I'll give you another marshmallow. So the idea is if that young little kid could delay gratification, they would get a reward later on. So that's what delaying gratification does. And then they assess these young people throughout their lifetime. And they found that the young ones that were able to resist eating the marshmallow for a greater reward later on had greater success throughout their life. So this is a very important aspect of greater success in life, and that's delaying immediate gratification for something more important down the road. And so one study found that, and an unpublished study on people on NoFap also found that the ability to delay gratification. It also found that they did better on psychological evaluation tests. They were healthier too after quitting porn. So that's what we're seeing. And what that tells us is that these conditions were not pre-existing. And what psychologists often incorrectly do is they just take a cross-section. That means they just take a snapshot of people using porn. They go, wow, porn use correlates with more depression and anxiety. That means that anxiety and depression leads to porn use. No, they're finding in the very few studies they've done that quitting porn actually relieves some anxiety or increases the ability to delay gratification. So we cannot assume that these mental problems lead to greater use. Maybe greater use leads to mental problems.
Got it. And for me personally, I would like to see, like we were struggling with the female part, I think I want to see something over there, try to pinpoint or figure out what's going on that side of the gender. And if there's any females that you recommend or any of our listeners can recommend to talk to, that would be fantastic. So here's a good question for you. How do we capture all of these anecdotes that seem to be coming up all the time online? And that just spreads not just across in your spectrum, but also in the food and health side of the world as well.
Yeah, that's the thing is I would love to take many of these anecdotes, and you got to remember the anecdotes I'm talking about that I have on my website. They're not of men complaining about porn-induced ED. There's hundreds of thousands of those. The stories I have are of men giving details of removing a single variable, and that's porn use, and recovering from chronic sexual dysfunctions. And of course, many other benefits occur. Now, I would like to data mine those and publish it, but that's not so easy to do. There's another huge subject which I know a lot about because I've published a paper, and I know scientists who've also published papers about porn. There's tremendous resistance, especially at the sexology journals, to these type of studies. And they will not only reject the studies, or they will then publish the studies and water down their findings. So this may sound conspiracy-like, but in fact, that's what's happening. I know what's going on behind the scenes, and I could write a book about it. So that's why I think a lot of these type of studies aren't occurring, is because the tremendous amount of resistance. In fact, I talked to Valerie Voon. Valerie Voon is the Cambridge University neuroscientist, one of the top in the world. I had a short conversation with her at a conference, and she said she was shocked. This is back in 2014, before she published that very first Cambridge University study that found that porn addicts' brains looked like drug addicts. And she said, I am shocked at the resistance to my study. And the study was fantastic methodologically, just fantastic. And she was shocked. And also the researchers at Max Planck Institute, I saw in an interview how they were shocked at the resistance at all these journals of getting their work published. So if the top neuroscientists at the top institutes in Europe are having trouble getting their great studies published, what's happening to some lowly, research student here in America at some, small university? I think there's a lot of resistance out there, and it's clear. It's clear to me.
And yes, and that we can interpolate across in the whole social spectrum, where we are more focused on consumerism, selling our products, more focused on taste, more focused on the pleasure responses, more on the instant gratification. Let's sell things quickly. And I think we've shot ourselves in the foot, and our younger generation is suffering thoroughly because of that. And you can see it across the board. No matter what industry you look at, you're seeing those effects, and it is causing emotional disturbance in a lot of our younger folks and even everyone, basically. So this will be a challenge.
I mean, just think about what's increased over the last, 20, 25 years. Obviously with food, we have obesity in young people, diabetes, conditions that are related to overeating. We have increases rates of ADHD, depression, anxiety, social anxiety have skyrocketed. We've had tremendous increases in sexual dysfunctions in young men. We've had tremendous decreases in sexual activity, in dating, in marriage. I mean, there's all sorts of changes that are occurring simultaneously because our environment has changed. It has given us, as you're pointing out, supernormal versions of things that we're supposed to gravitate towards. And of course, with the internet, it's sex, it's novelty, it's video games, it's social media. With food, it's junk food. So it's just amazing, and it's having an effect.
Yeah, and it is further catalyzed. It's like we're creating these perfect storms across the board where insecurities and fears and lack of social interaction further closes that clasps us down further into those loopholes. And then when you are hooked onto something, we think of it as taboo. And I think that's one of the reasons why the NoFap movement doesn't have this entire strong social presence, because everybody's afraid what everyone's going to think if they're, oh, something's wrong with me. Is that what's being noticed, or have you noticed that?
Well, it's very interesting. The NoFap name doesn't really represent what NoFap's about, and that's part of the problem. NoFap means no masturbation, so they people on that site sometimes focus on masturbation, but all of them focus on porn use, because what they're really saying is, I want to stop porn use. And so people who join it or even talk about it, they focus on, it's just anti-masturbation, when it's really men trying to give up porn and see how it has affected them. Other sites like on Reddit, like Porn Free, are more clear in their target. But what occurs is there's tremendous amount of propaganda out there. Some of the researchers, or former researchers, I should say, like Nicole Prouse, they actually have PR firms that get their crap put into major articles, like we saw one in Rolling Stone today, or one in Daily Beast, where Nicole Prouse is quoted as the expert, when in fact she is not at a university. She doesn't do studies on porn anymore, and she's extremely biased. And yet they leave out, a good 50 neuroscientists at Yale University or Cambridge or Max Planck who've done actual studies on porn, who have found brain changes, or urologists who've looked at men who have porn-induced ED and have published studies on it. In fact, the president of the European Society of Sexology, which oversees all European sexology organizations, he did a study on men with porn-induced ED, but that's completely ignored in all these articles. So there's a tremendous bias occurring and propaganda going out there. I don't want to sound like a crazy conspiracy theory, but I know what's going on. It's just amazing to me what's going on.
Exactly, and I think this is where people who are listening, people who are hearing the message, they need to start to make choices, and I think both genders need to figure out strategies to sort of fix some of these problems, which brings me to this one very interesting question, probably one of the harder ones. What do you think is love and a fulfilling relationship?
What do I think is love and a fulfilling relationship?
A very cliche question, but I want to know.
Yeah. Well, two people care about each other and will stand by each other even under the bad circumstances. That would be a loving relationship. And so that's what I see as one. And that's make it simple.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to throw a curveball at you. So here's another one. If you were to be given 3 wishes, what would they be?
3 wishes? What would they be? Oh, my. Not
be working in this field.
My wife just said something in my ear. She said, not working in this field. No, that's not one of them. I mean, it's been pretty challenging, so that was hard. Hey, I'd be like anyone else. I would take a few $1 billion. I could do a lot of good with that. That would be a fun thing. Things like, you want to say things like ending, world hunger, or, having everyone healthy. Of course, all of those are unreasonable, but I'm for a wish like that. Everyone to be happy and satisfied. That'd be great.
Awesome. Do you have anything else to add? I think we're at the closing period.
Now, the only thing I add, and I always add this at the end, and we've already discussed this, is that I really suggest to anyone who's using porn, and even if you're not using it a lot, maybe you're using it once a week or a couple times a month, give it up. Just remove it. And don't replace it with, surfing, dating sites, looking for pictures of women. Don't, replace it with going on YouTube and looking at videos. Just try to, for a month, get your sexual arousal through the real world and see how that affects you.
Awesome, got it. And lastly, how can people find you?
Well, I'm pretty easy to find. The name of my site is yourbrainonporn.com. And so it's a pretty extensive site with about 9,000 pages. And also I have a book called Your Brain on Porn. So that's also on Amazon.
Definitely. And that's a very good book. I would give it a thumbs up for anybody who's interested. Well,
and interesting enough, the proceeds from that book go to a charity, so I don't profit from any of this.
Well, you're fighting a tough battle, but you know what? We're here to support you. Let's see what we can do. But yeah, thank you so much for being on the Ketogeek podcast. It was an honor to have you. You've been an inspiration, and your words are gold, and a lot of people need to realize it and make some good choices in their life. And everybody else who's been listening to this podcast, you guys are awesome. And once again, Gary, thank you so much.
Hey, thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed our podcast, you will really love our newsletter where we share exclusive news, research content we are working on, discussions from our community, and so much more. All of this is available when you sign up for our newsletter. Oh, and you also get a 10% discount on all of our online store items. Go to ketogeek.com/sign up to access all of these goodies and join the low-carb playground. Once again, it is ketogeek.com/sign up. Till next time.